President Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 after the fall of Saigon, end of the Vietnam War, and Watergate scandal. Carter initially shifted U.S. foreign policy to cut ties with dictatorships and stand for human rights. However, he also sought a withdrawal of American strategic defense from positions around the world. However, the 1979 Iranian Revolution and Soviet intervention in Afghanistan prompted a shift in Carter's foreign policy. Furthermore, the 1979 Yemenite War increased Soviet action in the Middle East when they supported South Yemen. Carter had to change his foreign policy later in his term. Another issue that occurred during the Carter administration was the 1979 energy crisis, as the U.S. was dependent on foreign oil compared to the surges in Soviet oil production at the time. The Carter Doctrine was announced by Jimmy Carter in his 1980 State of the Union address after Carter withdrew from the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2, or SALT II. The Carter Doctrine was intended to use American military force to defend the Gulf states if necessary. The doctrine came about as a response to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and was meant to serve as a deterrent to any future Soviet actions that might occur within the Middle East. 3 previous Cold War doctrines had strengthened and reassured U.S. support for the Middle East in the face of Soviet expansion. These were the Truman, Eisenhower, and Nixon doctrines, which each played a role in forming the Carter Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine has stated that the U.S. would send military aid to countries threatened by Soviet communism and was to strengthen both Iran and Saudi Arabia's security. This was a containment measure against the Soviets. The Eisenhower Doctrine stated that the U.S. would send troops to Middle Eastern countries that were U.S. allies and had requested support against Soviet or Soviet-sponsored aggressive actions toward them. Another somewhat containment measure, but this time the Eisenhower Doctrine, unlike the Truman Doctrine, was coordinated with American Middle Eastern allies at their requests. Additionally, the Nixon Doctrine's application had provided military aid to Iran and Saudi Arabia so that U.S. allies could ensure peace and stability there without having as many American troops in country, as Nixon felt it was better for the U.S. to share defensive responsibilities with allies instead of having the U.S. do the defending for that government. President Carter had stated that an attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. The Carter administration began to build up the Rapid Deployment Force, which would eventually become CENTCOM. The Carter administration would not remain in the presidency to see the Carter Doctrine implemented. In October of 1981, President Ronald Reagan announced the Reagan Corollary to the Carter Doctrine following his victory over Carter in the 1980 election. The Reagan Corollary proclaimed that the United States would intervene to protect Saudi Arabia, whose security was believed to be threatened during the Iran-Iraq War at the time. While the Carter Doctrine warned away outside forces from the region, the Reagan Corollary pledged to secure internal stability within the Middle East. Although Reagan would send military support to the Afghan Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan, this was a measure of the Reagan Doctrine and not of the Carter Doctrine, as the Carter Doctrine was specific towards the Persian Gulf and not Afghanistan, although the doctrine was a reaction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The military support for the Mujahideen was also not part of the Reagan Corollary, which was aimed at Saudi Arabia in case the country was threatened by the Iran-Iraq War during the 80s. The Reagan Doctrine will be a separate video though, so don't worry about that. Both the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Corollary to the Carter Doctrine would be implemented by the George H.W. Bush administration during the 1991 Persian Gulf War, with the planning of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm as Iraq threatened Saudi Arabia's security. The Kirkpatrick Doctrine was a foreign policy strategy by Ronald Reagan's UN ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, who advocated for supporting dictatorships, particularly in Latin America, against communist insurgents. Her premise was that communist regimes were totalitarian while pro-Western dictatorships were only authoritarian, which isn't really saying much. The Kirkpatrick Doctrine was influential to an extent where the Reagan administration gave various degrees and levels of support to anti-communist dictatorships during the 1980s in Latin America, the Philippines, and other parts of the world. Did you know about the Carter Doctrine, Reagan Corollary to the Carter Doctrine, and Kirkpatrick Doctrine before this video? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.